Hello, welcome, and good evening or morning or whatever, depending on where you are. Welcome to our webinar that we are doing together with Alex, my good friend and colleague at Congree. Hi, Alex.
Hello.
And yeah, the normal housekeeping, of course, you are all muted. Everybody knows the spiel by now. There is a question and answer panel, so if you do have questions, pop them in there. We're trying to monitor that, and if the question kind of makes sense in the context of what we're just saying, then we'll address it. So let's jump right in. Who are we? Who's talking to you? Well, I'm Klaus. I'm from Kaleidoscope. Kaleidoscope is a company that focuses on terminology management and global content. And today I brought Alex from our partner Congree.
Yeah, hello. And we are on the other side a software vendor creating a software for content authoring, which helps you to ensure consistent terminology when you create your content, writing style and terminology.
Cool. And who are the two of us? I like to present myself as a terminological entry, of course. So here you see my preferred term, you see my creation users, my definition, a note, and my process status. So that is me. And Alex, you have a different way of doing that.
Indeed, yeah, I'm more like the tech guy. So I'm leading the sales team at Congree, but I basically started in the consulting in 2012 with Congree. And I'm very interested and focused on interface topics such as integrating with terminology systems such as Kaleidoscope Quickterm. And yeah, I'm happy to showcase you how terminology checks works with Congree UCC today.
Cool. So let's jump right into the topic. To start with, I'd like to briefly define terminology management, how we at Kaleidoscope even look at this. And I think terminology management has two sides to it. On the one hand side, it obviously is the process of establishing the correct and effective wording. Effective means that you understand what other people are saying and you don't have to ask back and clarify all the time. So it's really also effective and efficient for all the things in your organization or company. And the purpose of that is obviously to create clarity in your communication. But then on the other hand, we think terminology management also is a process that makes sure that content creators correctly and consistently use this terminology. And with terminology, we mean that a little bit broader than I think, particularly in the English speaking world. Terminology is very often only thought of as a list of words, but really for us, terminology is more than that. It can be product names, it can be slogans, it can be chunks of words, so not necessarily one word. That's why there's a whole discussion around whether we should call it micro content and not terminology. I personally think terminology is fine, but that's a different discussion. And when I present terminology like that nowadays, very often I get the question, why do we even need that? Now we have AI, everything is good. Why do we need terminology? And I say, good question, because actually AI is a game changer for us in terminology, because on the one hand side, it makes terminology management more efficient, and we'll show you a lot about that today. On the other hand, terminology could also make AI output more effective and more reliable. And we'll also show you a little bit about that. And what does terminology actually look like? Terminology is not a word list. We call that a glossary. But terminology really makes sure that it achieves the two major goals, which are consistency. So we want to make sure if we talk about this thing here, which is something that helps a motorcycle slow down, we want to make sure that whenever we refer to that, we call it a single piston brake caliper and not one of these other terms which might also be used in some parts of your organization or by outside users or who knows, your customers, but we really don't want to use those. And we also want to make sure that we use it for the correct thing. So if we say single piston brake caliper, we always refer to this thing and not something else. And then we can make sure that communication works. And of course, terminologists do that in all languages that your company operates in. And why do we do that? Well, we do that because we want to produce good content, readable, user-friendly, understandable content. We also do that because in content marketing, we want to have findable content. Search engine optimization is a huge thing in terminology. And also that when we work in modular content, that we can make sure that is also consistent. Terminology is also really important for machine translation engines and recently extremely helpful for AI and LLMs as well. We'll show you that a little bit. So when I say AI and terminology, what do we mean for? again, I think this has two sides, like everything in life. On the one hand side, AI or LLMs can contribute to terminology management by providing us sophisticated means for extraction, clustering, detecting relationships between terms and concepts, generating metadata. But then, of course, looking at Alex, who is down there on my screen, about terminology verification and terminology correction, of course. But the other way around as well, terminology can really help us control and get more precision out of LLMs. It provides natural language data to LLMs for additional context when it runs generation processes in translation, but also in content generation or chatbots or whatever. And we call this approach TAG, terminology augmented generation. And I'll come back to that at the end of our presentation, what that really is. So very briefly, we want to take you through the enterprise terminology management lifecycle, which we think starts at some sort of an input. So there is terminology extraction, either systematically because you have, I don't know, a document and you want to extract terminology or a website or whatever, or a database, or as a part of terminology checking, for example. Then this typically gets validated. Does this make sense? Is this correct? What additional information do I need? It typically gets approved in a company. There are sometimes committees or groups that approve terminology. This also happens in the target languages. We won't go into much detail about target languages in this webinar. Then we make sure it is enforced when content creators create their content. And last but not least, we want to integrate it with other systems and we want to distribute it. So for example, your cut tools, they have glossaries. Well, we need to make sure that the terminology gets to those cut tools and to the translators, but also to machine translation engines, to tools like Congree, or tools like, I don't know, SAP, engineering tools, software development tools. All of those can ingest terminologies nowadays, and we make sure they do. And the products involved here are obviously the ones that we manufacture, so Congree and Quickterm. So yeah, let's start in the beginning. Alex, over to you. How does this work while we check terminology? How can we extract terminology? While
Yeah,
we
it's
check content, sorry.
exactly. It's actually quite easy. So as you are hopefully checking your terminology anyway, so everyone who creates content within your company should stick to your company words. And so you have some kind of checking mechanics. And when using Congree, for example, as a checking plugin into your editor, you can use a feature called term candidate extraction right in the editor. You just select a text and propose it as a term, or you can ask the software to extract all the term candidates for you and compile a list of your terminology candidates in that document and then submit it to the workflows. There also is an option, that's the second picture in the background, to do this as a bulk operation over your existing content. For example, if you have CCMS documents or content somewhere, or a translation memory, or maybe other processes where you have a lot of data accumulated already, you can use that data to build up your terminology in a bulk operation.
Cool, thanks for that. And then basically this comes to us. So this is handed over to Quickterm automatically in the background, and then we work on it. So what do we do when we work on this? Well, this is typically somebody who has a little bit of terminological knowledge. We check if this is even a useful new term. Could be that, you know, the author sent us something useless, which is not really a term. We also have to check if this really is a new concept, or maybe it is just a synonym for a concept that already exists. We need to add the required metadata. We very often need to get input from subject matter experts. For example, can you please verify that this definition is correct? We need to get it approved. And then, of course, we need to put that into target languages. And that I actually want to show you live a little bit. So let me switch my share over. Okay. Share something else. It says here, this is a little bit new, this interface. Okay, I'm trying to share something else with you now. I hope this works. So this is what Quickterm looks like, our terminology database. We have a dashboard here. This is like for a professional, so I'm now logged in as Teresa. Teresa is our terminologist. You could also have simpler dashboards if this is for like a casual end user. You could have things like entries of the week, term quizzes, gamification things, just so terminology is not as boring to people who are not, you know, professional terminologists. And what Quickterm does and has as a USP compared to other terminology systems, we have a workflow. So for example, as Alex was extracting or suggesting a term here, brainwave, this got over here in Quickterm, and I got it in here as what we call a term request. So somebody wants brainwave to be included in the term base. So what we can do now as a terminologist is we can say, okay, interesting. Well, I'm going to work on that a little bit. So we open up this term request. We can add additional metadata. For example, the definition. We can ask AI to maybe, no, AI configuration is incomplete. I just fixed that. This is too bad. I hope the rest works, and it was only this one. So I won't auto-generate the definition now. I could obviously type it in. We can add other metadata like context, term source, or whatever other metadata we have defined in our term database. We can save that. I am going to put something here, just a thought. And then we can, for example, say, well, I really need a subject matter expert to verify this definition because I'm not sure if that is actually correct. So I can go in here, I can say I want to assign this as an edit task to a particular user based on a particular workflow with a deadline, etc., etc. And I can say I want you to edit the definition. And the nice thing here is if we do this and I now log in as a specialist or subject matter expert, the only thing I can edit really is this definition. So let me briefly do that. This is a bit cumbersome because Chrome now always hides the bookmarks. So I always have to start a new tab. So I'm now logging in as a subject matter expert. I should have some tasks. Yep. And one of them is actually this edit task where I'm supposed to edit the brainwave. So over here, it loads the preview of this entry and it shows me, okay, I'm allowed to edit the definition. And if I open it, you will see that really the only thing I can now edit is the definition. The rest I can see, of course, but I can only edit the definition. And that's important because you don't want people who are not terminologists messing up your valuable data. And then I basically say finalize, or depending on how this is set up, I can vote on it or against it. I have some other tasks here. For example, they sent me this 2-piston floating brake caliper to please approve it. So I can go in here and I can approve this or not. And this is basically how subject matter experts then interact with the terminology database. I'm going to go back in as Teresa now. I wanted to show you a little bit more AI magic. I hope this works, and only part of this is not working. So what I can also do as a terminologist, obviously, is I can go in here and I can create a completely new entry. So I can say create a new entry, and what we have implemented now is a basically Copilot. So I can actually chat with the term base, and what I could do is, for example, I have prepared a little prompt here, so I can say go in and say create a new entry for this term, add synonyms, label them forbidden or rejected, add other fields, add a definition, and somehow really the AI configuration got lost. So I can't show you that. Well, I'm not gonna bother fixing it. We don't have enough time for that. I know how to fix it, but takes too long. So basically we could generate the entire entry using the AI, even translate it into other languages. And one other thing I wanted to show you is because I think you mentioned that, Alex, or I mentioned it, that sometimes we get a term request and of course we don't know, is this a completely new term? Is this a synonym? So for example, here I got the term request disk drive. And what I can do now is I can check in our corpus, if we have all our corpus in our terminology extraction software, I could go in and I could check, is disk drive actually synonymous with something in the corpus? And then we can find, yes, look, disk drive, this new suggestion, this is actually synonymous to this disk drive. It's not very hard to detect that, granted, but there are some more sophisticated things in here. And this is actually an allowed term that belongs to an existing concept. So that means I know I can add disk drive to this concept. And by the way, also a couple of other system synonyms, which is important because what we see sometimes is that our customers have all the lists of the positive terms, so of the things they do want to use, but they don't have a list of the things they don't want to use. And then a terminology verification tool really has a hard time. And with that, I hand back over to you, Alex, to show us how terminology verification works. I'm gonna stop sharing and I think you take over.
Yep.
I will fix the AI stuff in the meantime, then I can show you later. It's funny.
Perfect. Okay, so now let's have a look on how to enforce the terminology when creating content. So when we do build up the terminology in a company to define how we want to name things, how to communicate with the market, we also want to make sure that it really is used when someone creates content in the company. And using generative AI, creating content has gotten easier a lot. So everyone basically can use any kind or some kind of AI to generate a blog post, a short description of the product in the ERP system, or some website content. And so it's even more important to ensure that when all those people create content, that in the place where they create the content, that you write the content according to your writing style guide and your terminology, because you want to make sure that you are communicating to the market in your particular company compliant manner. And that's what Congree is used for. And before we have a look at how this actually works, I would like to explain you a bit the background of this check. As promised, I'm more like the technical guy, so that's why we immediately get a deep dive into the linguistic topics. So we have two components in our language checker, basically. One is the so-called linguistic language check. We also call it linguistic intelligence by now. And that's more like a very sophisticated analysis of your content. For example, if you write a sentence like ferroelectricity traditionally is believed to only occur in compounds, that's a proper sentence. And we can check that sentence, and we can also identify the grammatical structure of the content. That's what you can see below the first bullet point on the left side. That's this bracketing structure. It shows us that Congree identified the main clause, that there's an infinitive subclause, that there is a prepositional extension of the sentence, that we have interpunction, and that ferroelectricity is a noun, for example. This is actually not quite as easy to identify for a machine in English, because every noun also can be a verb, basically. And the software knows about that. So it knows how sentences can be formed, and it even knows that on word level. That's what we have on the right side on the slide, with the example of the word from reactivations, for example. The software knows that reactivation is derived from the stem active, that it has some prefixes and derivational suffixes, and that it is a plural word form based on the word formation. This simply is linguistic knowledge that our software brings. And when you check something in the editor, we do all those linguistic analysis and can use it to check for spelling, grammar, for writing style, for terminology, and for abbreviation. The way how this works actually is that the system assumes that you are writing correct, because if you write correctly, then we can analyze everything. The software knows the language, it knows how to form sentences, how to form words, so everything should be, so we should be able to analyze everything. If there is something we cannot analyze, then maybe there's an issue, like an issue in the congruency. Maybe you introduce something in singular and then use some plural word form, then this doesn't match within the sentence, and we can show you a notification. Hey, have a look at this. But even if you have a perfectly grammatically fine sentence, and that's typically what you also have when you generate content using artificial AI, artificial intelligence, then it might violate your writing style guide. Maybe you have a tone of voice guideline that defines that you talk to your customers in a specific way. Maybe you have writing guidelines defining how you have to write a repair manual in order to make sure that nobody gets hurt while repairing some difficult machinery. Then you really need to ensure that you are writing that way. And it's one thing that you are writing grammatically correct, so that spelling and grammar is fine, but also checking that certain stylistic issues do not occur is the other thing. And that's what Congree also supports you in. So we can check for your custom-specific writing style guides while creating your content. And of course, part of this is to check or to ensure that your terminology is used correctly. And in respect of the terminology, one particular focus, of course, if you have this kind of deep linguistic analysis, you can also have a very nice terminology, term variant recognition. So for example, if you define in your term base that you name a certain component in your software terminology panel, as we did, for example, then if someone writes panel for terminology, you want to make sure that this is flagged and the software tells the writer, hey, you wrote panel for terminology, or maybe the AI wrote it that way, but we defined that we always want to name a terminology panel, and to make sure that nobody confuses it somehow, please also use terminology panel in your content. And then we will flag panel for terminology automatically, just based on the information that you defined in your term base that we would like to name a terminology panel. That's a so-called syntactic variation, and that's something Congree can find automatically. There's something similar down here with fuel mix and mix of fuels, also a syntactic variation, but there also is more fancy algorithms or more fancy recognition patterns like synonym detection, for example. Engine and motor, for example, can be synonym. They don't have to, but they can be. And you can configure the system to automatically recognize those synonym relations. So if you define gasoline motor in your content, you could also automatically identify gasoline engine or any variation that uses engine instead of motor, which is stored in your term base, but with motor. And that's a very advanced feature, as Klaus already said. Sometimes you only have the preferred forms as some sort of positive list, maybe based on a glossary you have for translation, and then you are lacking all the forbidden variants, or maybe the variants that are only allowed in a certain use case, like for marketing content. And by using that preferred term list, basically, in the check, you can find all the variant or most of the variants automatically. And all the rest you can still add as deprecated terms in Quickterm, for example. Maybe one last slide before we have a look at the software itself. I would like to show you how the terminology actually is provided to the linguistic engine. So there is a process that's typically automated. You define your terms as we have seen in the workflow in Quickterm, and then Congree pulls the terminology from Quickterm automatically. This is typically a job that runs once per night. And we define which terminology to use. We don't use candidates. You first have to release them within the workflow. So don't worry, some candidates really are in a candidate pod. But once you make them public and available to your users, Congree automatically learns them and make them available to the linguistic engine. The reason why this is an asynchronous process is because sometimes you have different names for your term status. Typically, in the Congree world, we name it preferred form for the one and only form you would like to use. But some people tend to name them standard, for example. And in order to match your names in the term base, how you name things there to the linguistic engine, check and explain it. What is this actually? Is this the correct form, or is it only allowed, or is it forbidden? We do have some kind of data mapping, and using the data mapping, we learn the terminology automatically. But now let's have a look on how this works in the editor. Imagine you open up some existing content and would like to extend this content. In this content, you have a Congree integration. It's always an editor plugin, and there's all sorts of editor plugins out there. So we have a lot of popular XML editors like Oxygen XML, for example. There also is Adobe FrameMaker, InDesign. So usually the kind of editors you use to create your contents, there's also a Congree editor plugin for it. And it can start automatically like I did with Word here, but you can also configure it to be turned off by default and start it reactively if you need it for a review, for example. The default usage then is if you click to a content, then this content is checked with the Congree language check, this panel here. And if you find some violations, in this case, I violated my style guide, we will show you a notification and tell you, hey, please correct this. And this is where AI comes in handy, because our linguistic engine, with this deep linguistic knowledge, it can identify all your violations of the style guide and pinpoint the issues in your content. And on the other hand, generative AI can provide us proposals on how to improve the content. And those proposals are shown here. They also get an AI icon so that you can be sure to review it first before applying it to the editor. But if you like the rephrased version, you can click it and replace the content in the editor. So it's quite easy to follow your style guide by using an AI-supported language check such as Congree. You can also do a document check. So if you want to show more messages in the language check panel, or maybe want to verify that all of your document is correct, you can basically check it from top to bottom, and then you get an overall real-time report about the check content. You also get an indicator, it's called release level in the Congree world, on how good your content actually is and how much you need to improve it before you are able to release the content to your audience. That's the green bar here. It's a score between 0 and 100. And regarding the terminology, we can see here, for example, that we define that a product has to be named, including the company name at the beginning. The form without the company name is okay. If we double tap the message, we get some additional information. But we also get a correction proposal that says, hey, maybe better use the preferred form and apply it to the document. And we can then click it and apply it to the editor. That's already everything you need to do to check content in your editor. And that's kind of easy for users not being used that much to terminology because they get all those correction proposals and rephrasals from the software. You just have to check their content and evaluate, is the proposal valid or not. We have seen the term candidate extraction as well. So while we check the content, we also extracted all sorts of term candidates. We already did the check if something is in the term base already. If a term candidate was already found in the term base, we will not propose it in this list again. But if it's not yet in the term base, then we will show it here and you can submit it to the term candidate process. What you can also do is you can always select something in the editor and say, hey, I would like to use result in my term base because it has a special meaning in my company. And then you highlight a word, click the corresponding button, and then you have a term candidate that can be submitted to the term base. And you can even already provide some additional information for the terminology workflow, such as a definition proposal or maybe a note that helps the terminologist or the people who take care of the terminology to create an entry from it. Yeah, and that's basically what I wanted to show you in the editor. So it's a brief overview on how Congree can support you very easily when creating content.
Cool, thanks. I will take back over, and in the meantime, I have fixed my AI problem. Find this is weird in the new interface how you now share. And basically, I can take over from exactly where you just stopped. So you sent me a term proposal. It was result, and now here I have bank. So obviously, we're not doing this real time right now. You didn't actually also click on send. But I wanted to show you the AI feature here. So for example, here I have the term bank. And of course, if I want to create a definition and I click on create a definition here, please, this will very likely be the bank where you go and leave your money or get money. But for example, if Alex also sent me context, remember you have this context window there. So let's say, well, this is about river, for example, and then I recreate this definition, then very easily it knows, okay, it's talking about that particular bank. And also what I wanted to show you is our Copilot. So if I go back out here and I say create new entry, we have our Copilot. So what I could do here, for example, is, and I prepared this so I don't have to type it. So for example, I can say create a new entry in these two languages for Kaleidoscope. So it does that here quite simply. Then I can say, for example, add some useful synonyms for that. This is not always very useful depending on what the AI just thinks about. Mustersichtgerät is a really interesting one, actually. But then I can say other things, for example, like I want you to label the allowed ones preferred, and I want to label the incorrect ones rejected. I want to add all other term fields. I want to add a definition to it, and it basically does all that. Obviously, this has to be reviewed. You could now send it into a review process, for example, in Quickterm, and I could even say translate this into 10 other languages, and it would do that. But we want to go back to our, share something else. We want to go back to our process that we were talking about. So I'm going to go back here to PowerPoint. So we're now at the end. So in the end, I have the terminology, I have content, that's all taken care of, but we also want it in other applications. For example, we also want it in our cut tools. We have various ways of doing that, including a complete API, including the possibility to store repositories somewhere else. But one very powerful feature is what we call the publishing feature that allows us to send terminology or parts of the terminology to all kinds of different tools. By the way, Congree is over here using the API, but we can send it, for example, to Trados or Phrase or MemoQ or DeepL or other machine translation engines, etc. And I briefly wanted to show you how that works, although it's not super exciting. So here I have my terminology in Quickterm. In this case, I use Trados Cloud. We have a lot of customers that have both. And here I just created a brand new term base. So this is empty. It has 0 entries. And now what I can do over here, either manually or I can, of course, also do this automatically based on the schedule. I can say I want to publish my term base or maybe parts of it. I want to publish that over to Trados. And then it basically gets all the terms from Quickterm and sends them over to Trados using the API. So in the background, it's now populating this. So you can see it already has 10, and then I don't know, after a couple more seconds, it has the rest. So we can map the fields. Obviously, there's a very specific way in Trados to label allowed and forbidden terms. Obviously, we can label all that. Right, the video is longer, but since we're already getting towards the end of the time, I did want to go on to the question, okay, well, how do I get this into my LLM? Because I can't really export it there. No, we can't. But as I said, we have this terminology augmented generation approach, which is based on RAG. A lot of you might know RAG, but it's a little bit different because instead of embedding content somewhere in a vector database, and it's all very cryptic and hard to control and slow, by the way, what we do is we actually just add a terminology query. So a user asks something using, for example, Microsoft Copilot or an LLM translation tool somewhere. But then the LLM can automatically look up stuff in the term base. And the way that works is in TAG, we use the fact that term bases follow a very strict meta model. So we know exactly where to find what information. We don't have to guess where the definition is. We don't have to guess if a term is allowed or not. It's in the term base. We know exactly where. We know exactly how to retrieve it. We know which formats the LLM wants this as. So for example, translation engine, it wants prose, it wants translate A as X, if this and that is the case. And we do it in real time using the API. And LLMs actually don't use APIs, they use what's called an MCP server. So what we do is we put an MCP server next to the LLM. And what happens then is if a user, for example, says, can you translate this email into Spanish? The LLM will understand, oops, this is about translation. My MCP server has a tool, they call that tool or function if you want, that is called fetch translations from term base or something like that. So it automatically calls the term base and says, give me all the possible translations for this sentence. And this, of course, is great. And I want to show you an example here, not to go too much over time. So for example, here we have an interesting sentence, translate from Spanish into English. Pusieron varias velas, blah, 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 de la gran vela blanca. So we have a typical homonym. Vela means two different things in Spanish. There are some funny children rhymes about that. But if we do this with tag, tag immediately says, I find two concepts in the term base. And then it says there's one concept here where vela is translated as sail, like a sail of a sailboat, and the other one where it's translated as candle. And as you can see, it does it correctly, simply by providing this little bit of context, just a few words to the LLM. Different example in German, for example, the term insulation in English is a problem because insulation, if it's electric, is Isolierung, but if it's heat, it's Dämmung. It's not Isolierung. And again, just by giving it that little term, just with the definition, the LLM gets it right. So it really doesn't need a lot to get it right. The same works for term checking, of course. As I said, the little brother of Congree, so we don't do all the sophisticated stuff, but we can disambiguate. So the cold start knob is forbidden, and there's actually two different allowed variations depending on which kind of cold start knob we had, whether the one is for carburetors or it's the one for the fuel injection. But there are other use cases. For example, we could plug this into a chatbot. And for example, if I ask GPT, what is a bolter miner? GPT says, I have no clue. This is a neologism or technical jargon, or I don't know, give me some more context. And tag gives it more context, and then it produces the definition. We can also use it for creating documents. So for example, if I say write something about engines, it'll retrieve everything it knows about engines from the term base, including things like the definition, and then it gets it right by looking all that up. So you can see really cool use cases for how terminology content can actually improve AI output. And this has a big consequence on the business model of terminology, because terminology management is always problematic because it needs a business model behind it. And with AI, we can bring down the costs. As you saw, we can generate metadata, we can extract stuff, we can find synonyms or relations, a lot of things we can do with AI. But at the same time, it increases the benefits that terminology has in your company. So that means at the end of the day, and actually also in the beginning of the day, that's a better ROI for terminology management in your company. And yeah, with that, we're at the end. Sorry for being 5 minutes over, but I think we did it in record time, given that we needed an hour for the same thing in German. But then, of course, German words are longer than English, so it takes a little bit longer. And we're still here. If there are any questions, type them into the question. If you don't have a question, don't feel obliged to stay. So somebody already says, can you see the questions, Alex? I'm not sure if this one is for me or for you. It's a very long question. Okay, I'm going to read the question because obviously the audience can hear it. Since linguistic engine analyzes words on morpheme level, do inflected, suffix, etc. Get detected by the term recognition? I think this is for you.
Yes, exactly. That's the case. So due to this morphologic analysis, we do know how the word forms are inflected, and we find all those term variants. You're also asking for actually native languages. The linguistic language check that does this kind of deep linguistic analysis is available for the languages English, German, French, and Spanish. For the other languages, we fall back to simpler mechanics like fuzzy matching or stemming.
The second question, I think, is more for me. It asks about whether we support structured data models such as TBX. So yes, of course, the data models are completely free on our end, as well as when we map it to Congree. There is another one about the variant recognition. I think that one is again for you.
Yeah, I found the question area too now. Yeah, so the question is, yeah, we do have this term variant recognition, but there might be overlaps between multiple concepts. So as you have shown this particular case where wave in one context is more like something with water and wave in another context is more like something with brain waves, or I did a bank, I think it was in one case, it's something you can sit on, in the other case, it's something that's a financial institute. Here, we actually rely on the data model in the term base. So typically, you flag those terms. A usual example is if you are a large company and having multiple divisions doing different parts, like one division is doing the software, one division is doing the mechanical parts, and you flag those terms where they belong to. And when I use Congree in the editor, I always use a checking profile. So I do already know what kind of or what subset of the terminology to use. If that's not possible, if you kind of have to show that it might belong to one case or might belong to the other situation, then we can show additional information from the term base, like a usage node or this attribute that shows where do I belong to. And then the users can decide which version to use depending on the context. And this is also one of the benefits of using Congree inside of the editor. You don't have to leave your editing process. You can stay within the editor. There's a feature in the Congree sidebar where you can see all those additional information, and then you can decide on which form to use in your particular context and then move on to the content again.
There's a question about how this works in translation environments. So I'm not sure if this is for me or for you, but the way Quickterm looks at this is we think that, we say that Quickterm is I call it single source of truth. So all the terminology lives inside Quickterm. And from there, we populate other systems. And that includes cut tools. That includes Congree, obviously. Congree uses our API to retrieve the terms and make sure they're up to date. But as I showed you, for example, I populated Trados Cloud. In the Trados example, actually, we also have a plugin directly into the Trados tools. Trados is the only cut tool that actually lets you do these kind of plugins. So in the other cut tools, we don't have direct plugins, but we have integrations into pretty much all the other major TMSs that are out there. So we basically publish completely automatic. So this is in the background running Delta publication processes every hour if you want, or day or minute or whatever, or week. So we make sure that we keep the terminology up to date in all of these other cut tools. And that sometimes solves a couple of the issues that you have with other TMSs. For example, some TMSs can't really filter the term base. So if you do terminology checking, you always get a lot of false errors that aren't really errors, simply because a term, yes, it is forbidden, but not in the context that you are using. So then what we can do is we can publish out 5 or 10 or 20 glossaries to those cut tools, and then you just use the correct one. Same with DeepL, for example. We typically don't publish one glossary out to DeepL, but we publish out several that are somehow filtering the content of the term base, so that you can make sure if I do, I don't know, translate something for marketing or for product A or product B, I can make sure I'm using the correct dictionary. And then there's one last question, which is kind of for both of you, talking about how the Congree plugin works in Word. How does that work bilingually? So on our end, we do have a terminology verification engine that works bilingually, very similar to the one that works in the cut tools. And Alex, over to you. I don't know if you have an answer for bilingual checking and the
Yeah,
translation process.
actually, usually within the translation process, we are not involved. We are more like involved in checking the content in the first place when it is created, because if you send in the correct content, including the correct terminology into the translation process, it also is found, for example, or picked up by the glossaries provided to the translation process. And then you also have good translations in the end. However, there is cases where we also do a post-translation check. In those cases, we basically wait until the content is returned from the translation process, and we then check it before it goes into the translation process, and we check it afterwards to find out, was there something messed up inside of the translation process. This is typically the case when using DeepL or automatic translation, because even if you supply glossaries to those systems, there sometimes is variations, or in particular those cases where you need to use a certain domain of your terminology for the content, where Congree then can find those variants afterwards and even provide you proposals for automatic correction.
Cool. So it shows that somebody followed our webinar really intensely. Thank you for all those questions. Feel free to reach out to us. There's our emails here on the screen. And other than that, yeah, for all of those who are still listening, thanks for staying a little bit longer and enjoy the rest of your day, evening, whatever. Bye.
Bye.